Welcome to the channel and enjoy my new story. You know that feeling when something seems wrong, but you convince yourself it's fine because the truth would be unbearable? That was my life with Mark. I ignored the little things. The late-night phone calls, the extra trips to network over dinner, the way he stopped kissing me goodbye before leaving for work. I told myself he was stressed. I told myself it was normal. The day started with hope. I was finally going to tell Mark about the baby. He'd always said he wanted a family. I imagined his face lighting up when I told him, how he'd pull me into one of his rare, genuine hugs. That hope carried me through the morning as I cleaned the house and shopped for the ingredients for his favorite lasagna. Around 3 p.m., my phone rang. "Mrs. Carter?" The voice was polite, professional. "Yes?" I replied, unsure. "This is Natasha from the Marriott, New York. We hope you enjoyed your recent stay with us. I just wanted to confirm everything met your expectations." My stomach dropped. "I didn't stay at your hotel. You must have the wrong number." "Apologies," she said, though I could hear the hesitation in her voice. "We have you listed as the guest accompanying Mr. Carter. Perhaps there's been a mistake." She hung up, but I couldn't. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. Mark had been there last weekend. A business trip, he said. Just a couple of meetings and back home. Who was Mrs. Carter? When Mark came home, I was still reeling. The sound of his keys in the door jolted me. He walked in, briefcase in hand, his tie already loosened. "What's for dinner?" he asked without looking at me. "Lasagna," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He grunted approval and sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. "How was the Marriott?" I asked casually, setting a plate in front of him. His head snapped up. "What? The Marriott, New York. They called today. Said they wanted to confirm your stay with Mrs. Carter." For a moment, his face was blank. Then he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You're imagining things, Anna." I clenched my fists. "They used my name. Who was Mrs. Carter?" His smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold stare. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said. "I'm the one who pays for this house, this food, everything you use. I'm the one who works. If I want to spend my free time however I want, I will. You should be grateful I even come home at all." I stood there, stunned, as he calmly cut into his lasagna, chewing like we were discussing the weather. That night, lying in bed, I rested a hand on my stomach. The baby. He didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted him to. The days after Mark acted as though nothing had happened, but I couldn't unhear his words. Grateful he came home? That wasn't love. That was power. Mark wasn't always cruel, at least not in obvious ways. There were times he could be so charming, so warm, that it made me forget the way his words cut like a knife. I remember one evening not long after we got married. I had burned dinner. Something simple, pasta, I think. I was standing by the sink, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on a pan, tears pricking my eyes. Mark came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "It's just pasta, Anna," he said softly, his lips brushing my ear. "You don't have to be perfect all the time. I don't expect that from you." It felt like a balm to my wounded pride. But looking back, I realize now that his kindness often came with strings attached. Moments like that kept me tethered, even when things started to go wrong. Later that night, he added with a laugh, "Just don't let it happen again. My clients expect better." It seemed like a joke at the time. But it wasn't. Not really. As the years passed, Mark's charm grew more conditional. When I tried to talk to him about feeling neglected, he'd sigh and shake his head. "You're imagining things, Anna," he'd say, his tone patient but dismissive. "I work hard for us. If I'm tired, it's because I'm trying to give you a good life." He made me doubt myself constantly. When I expressed concern about his late nights or found suspicious receipts, he'd laugh and say, "You're too sensitive. Stop overthinking everything." There were times I felt like I was going crazy, like I was the problem. But every now and then he'd do something kind. A bouquet of flowers, a spontaneous weekend getaway, and I'd convince myself that he still cared. I think part of Mark's behavior stemmed from his childhood. His father had been a domineering man, a strict authoritarian who believed emotions were weaknesses. I'd only met him a few times, but the dynamic between them was clear. "You can't let people walk all over you," his father once told him in my presence, his voice sharp. "You're the man. You set the rules. Never let anyone forget that." Mark nodded like a dutiful son, absorbing those words as gospel. When I tried to discuss it with him once, he shrugged it off. "That's just how he is," he said. "And you know what? He's not wrong. A man has to be strong if he wants respect." I didn't realize then how deeply those lessons had shaped him, or how much they'd eventually hurt me. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Mark surprised me. He sat me down and apologized. "I know I've been distant," he said, taking my hand. "Work has been a lot lately, but I'm doing all this for us, Anna, for our future." For a moment, I almost believed him. I wanted to believe him. Then, just a week later, I found the receipt from that dinner for two. That was when it all clicked. The late nights, the phone calls, the Marriott. He wasn't working late. He wasn't doing this for us. He was doing it for himself. His apology had been nothing more than a tactic to keep me in line. I started taking small steps. At the grocery store, I bought the cheaper bread and tucked the difference into an old makeup bag I hid in the back of the closet. I began walking to the library, telling Mark I was picking up a book, when really, I was researching lawyers and women's shelters. I thought I was being careful, but Mark noticed. "What are you up to?" he asked one evening, his tone suspicious. "Nothing," I said with a forced smile. "Just reading." "Good," he said, his voice low. "Keep it that way." I stayed quiet, but inside I was seething, and I contacted the lawyer. She explained my rights, helped me prepare, and gave me a list of places I could go if I needed immediate help. The night I left, I waited until he was asleep. My suitcase was small, just enough for essentials. My heart pounded as I crept through the house, every creak of the floorboards making me flinch. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. Mark didn't make it easy. The day after I left, he called, again and again. His voice on the other end of the line ranged from icy rage to pitiful begging. "You'll never survive without me." He snarled one minute, only to plead the next, "Come back, Anna, we'll fix this." But I didn't go back. At first, survival was all I could focus on. I stayed with my best friend Elena in her one-bedroom apartment. She gave me the couch without hesitation, and for the first few nights, I barely slept, afraid Mark would show up at her door. Every creak in the hallway outside made me flinch. "Don't worry," Elena said, gripping my hands. "He won't touch you. You're safe here." Safe. It felt like an alien concept. Money was tight. The small stash I'd hidden away didn't last long, and every ruble spent felt like a countdown. I went to sleep hungry some nights, afraid to touch Elena's food. She worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and I couldn't stand the thought of adding to her burden. "You're not a burden," she said one evening when I finally confessed how guilty I felt. "You're my best friend, Anna, and you're going to get through this. We'll figure it out together." Still, guilt wasn't the only weight I carried. I wrestled with fears about the baby constantly. Could I provide for them? Would they grow up resenting me for leaving their father? Some nights, I lay awake, one hand on my growing belly, whispering promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "We'll be okay," I murmured, though my voice wavered. "I'll make it work, I promise." I found a women's shelter through the lawyer I'd spoken to before I left. They helped me get back on my feet, offering a place to stay for a few weeks while I sorted out the basics: documents, prenatal care, and eventually a small studio apartment. The apartment was barely big enough to hold a bed and a table, but it was mine. The first night I slept there, I cried, not from sadness, but from relief. The shelter also connected me with other women who had escaped situations like mine. I met Maria, a single mother of 2, who offered advice on budgeting and finding work. She became something of a mentor, reminding me daily that I wasn't alone. "I've been where you are," she said during one of our long talks. "You're stronger than you think. You'll get through this, and one day, you'll look back and be proud of yourself." The baby came early, a boy with dark eyes and a wail that pierced through my exhaustion. Holding him for the first time, I felt a mix of joy and fear. Joy because he was perfect. Fear because I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. I named him Victor, a victory for us both. The first months were a blur of sleepless nights, bottles, and moments of overwhelming doubt. There were days I felt like I was failing him, when I couldn't soothe his cries, when I realized I'd forgotten to buy enough diapers. But then he'd look at me, his tiny hand grasping mine, and I'd remember why I was fighting so hard. When Victor was 3 months old, I started working as a receptionist at a small clinic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I arranged childcare through a local community group, though handing my baby over to strangers every morning felt like tearing out a piece of my heart. Each day, I juggled work, Victor, and the weight of trying to rebuild a life from scratch. Some nights I cried into my pillow, wishing for an easier path. But I never regretted leaving, not once. Now, as I sit by the window in our tiny but warm apartment, Victor asleep in his crib, I think about everything we've been through. Mark's words still haunt me sometimes, his sneers, his threats, but they don't hold power over me anymore. Every day I prove him wrong. The road ahead is still uncertain. I'm saving money for a better apartment and taking online courses to improve my skills. I dream of a future where Victor doesn't have to know the struggle it took to build a life for us. Sometimes I catch myself smiling when I think about how far we've come. Victor's laughter fills the apartment, his little milestones reminding me of the strength I didn't know I had. "We're going to be okay," I tell him as he sleeps, my voice steady now. "I promise." And this time, I believe it.